There you go.
All right. Well, welcome everyone to our Brown Bag series, Exploring the Barriers to Health and Safety, that is hosted by the Pathways Statewide Steering Committee with the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault and the Council on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. My name is Cammie Moore, and before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick reminder to have folks mute their lines and not put us on hold, as well as remind folks that our next series will be, let me just double check my date, will be Tuesday, September 24th at noon, and it's on deconstructing gender to address barriers to health and safety. So today we are really lucky to have Paul Kivel with us, who is a leader in social justice and has worked to engagement and violence prevention for several years. And I will let him introduce himself and tell you a little bit more about himself, but welcome, and we're really excited to have Paul here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's great to be here. It's not my preferred way to talk to people and work with people, but it's what we have, and it's the miracle of modern technology that allows us to even have the conversation together. Let's see. So I want to do several things with you to give you some sense of the work that I and a whole network of folks have been doing over the last decades to address issues of violence and social justice in our communities, and open it up to conversation and questions, and make it as interactive as we can make it in this format. And I know that we're all going to be disembodied voices to each other, and our minds are going into the telephone waves. But I encourage everybody to relax your body, to pay attention to your body. Make sure you continue breathing nice and fully and steadily through our conversation, and not become just disembodied as we have this kind of intellectual conversation. I want to start off with some acknowledgments, do a little bit of context setting, and then kind of give a history of some of the work that we've done and how I got to be here, and what some of the things that we've learned from that, and then kind of explore a few of the tools that we use when we're working with adults and young people in our communities. And of course, I'm in Oakland, California. I have done a lot of work in California and around the country, but all communities are very different, and you'll have to, hear what I'm saying through the lens of your own community and your own needs, and kind of sort it out as you go along. I'm glad to have further conversations with folks after this session by phone or email to explore ways to adapt or make more appropriate some of the things that we've done. So with all that being said, I want to just start off by acknowledging the creative spirit in the world that connects us to each other, even over the phone, connects us to the animal and plant life around us and to the earth. I want to acknowledge the earth itself that nurtures and sustains us. I want to acknowledge the Native peoples whose land we all are on, and if you're a First Nations person, then you are on hopefully your own land, but for many of us we are on Native land and are not Native, so it's important to acknowledge that as well. I also want to acknowledge my own Jewish foreparents who have taught me so much about survival and about justice, both. And of course, even to have this kind of conversation, it is dependent on the work of many people around the world who provide the foundation for the lives that we lead. So think about who made your clothes, who made your cell phone, the computer, the technology that we're using, who grows the food that you eat, our lives are completely intertwined with the work of people mostly very low paid and invisible to us around the world. So I want to acknowledge the necessity we have to recognize ourselves as intertwined with all of this work and with the life around us. So I'd encourage you to just take a moment and think to yourself, who would you add to what I just named in terms of acknowledgments? Whose shoulders do you stand on? Who makes it possible for you to do this work and to be in these conversations? And I think it's important that whenever we have these conversations, which we can get very much caught up in the day-to-day work that we're doing, to take a moment and name the context that we're in a little bit. So in my mind, there are three major crises that we face in the world, in our country, and I want to name those and talk about their relationship to the issues that we are addressing. The first is war, the fact that we are at war in several different countries, that there are the U.S. has military bases around the world and is the largest provider of arms to throughout the world in all kinds of conflicts, whether we're directly or indirectly involved. And of course that has a lot of implications for those of us doing work, violence prevention work in our communities. One is that the tremendous amount of money, obviously, that goes to war and militarism comes out of our social services and communities, our schools and health cares and things like that. Another impact of that is that at the highest levels of government, our political leaders are modeling aggression and war as ways to solve problems. And of course, we're working in our communities trying to promote other ways to solve problems besides aggression and violence. And of course, it also means that in our everyday culture, in our movies and video games, that war and militarization is glamorized and glorified, and it's also, directly counter to the work that we're trying to do in our communities. So that's one set of contexts. Another context is the economic depression that we're in. Probably many of you know people who have out of work or have lost homes or are financially insecure in some way. And of course that has a lot of impact on our families and communities and the stress that people are under, the insecurity that people face. And then the final crisis I think we face is the climate change crisis. And I talk to few people these days who don't have, at some level, especially young people, have at some level are deeply concerned about the future of the world and what we're doing to the natural environment that we depend upon. So we're not going to be talking about these major issues in this hour that we have together, but they are the context and they have direct impact on the community, each of us ourselves, but also our family members, community members, and the people that we're working with. So I found that in my work there are two questions that help guide me in doing the work that that I've done. And the first question is a standard question that we ask ourselves. The question, what do you stand for? What kind of person are you? Are you a person of integrity, of honesty? Can people trust you? It's an important question to ask, particularly in a society in which people are pushed to be competitive and individualistic and not take care of each other and ignore and neglect those who are more marginalized. We have to constantly ask ourselves, are we standing true to the values that we hold? But the second question I think is equally as important and one we don't often ask ourselves, and it's the question of who do you stand with? It actually says how on the slide, but it should say who do you stand with? And so I want to say a little bit about that so it's clear what I mean. when I first started doing social justice, racial justice work in the 1960s, African Americans came to some of us who were white, and they were angry and outraged at the levels of racism they were facing. And my first response to that was kind of throw up my hands and say, well, I'm not racist. I treat everybody with respect. I'm innocent is what I was really saying. I'm not part of this. And they said, well, that's good, but we face racism in our school system, in our healthcare system, in the job market, in the housing market. Do you stand with us in the struggle for racial justice? And that was a much more difficult question to answer for me, because they were asking not what do you say, what do you stand for, but what are you doing? Are you showing up in the struggles that we have? 10 years later, being somewhat of a slow learner, women came to some of us who were men, and they were angry and outraged at the levels of male violence that they were facing. And again, my response was, well, I treat women with respect. I don't hit my partner. I do half of the chores and the child care. And I was saying, well, I'm a good guy. I'm innocent. I'm not part of this. And again, they said, well, that's fine, but there's 2 or 3 million women a year who are battered by their partners in the United States. Do you stand with us in the struggle to end male violence? And again, I had to step back and say, well, how am I showing up? What am I actually doing to make a difference? So the work that I and others have done has really been around that second question. Who do you stand with? How do you show up as an ally in the community to make a difference, to work towards justice, towards safety and healing in our communities? And that's really what the focus of what I'm going to say today is, and this conversation. So a little bit about the history of the work and how I got involved. In the late 1970s, some of us who were men in the San Francisco Bay Area got together to talk about our lives and relationships and what worked, what didn't. And we realized that a lot of what didn't work in our lives had to do with how we were raised to be men. And at the same time, women were on the front lines of, were setting up battered women's shelters, rape prevention centers, child assault prevention centers, excuse me. And we're, working, building a movement to end male violence. And some of us decided we wanted to respond to that, to do something. And so we went to some of the women we knew and we asked, what can we do to support the work you're doing? And they said, well, we're dealing with the women. Women are struggling to survive, and we're trying to support them. But it's men who are doing the violence, and your men talk with the men. And basically our first response is, well, is there anything else we can do? Can we do some child care? Can we do some filing in the office or sweep the floors? Anything but talk to the men, because, of course, they were the bad guys, and we thought we were the good guys, and we wanted to make sure there was a lot of difference between us. And they looked pretty scary, and, we didn't know what to do. But the women were very clear, and so we had to take that seriously. It was one of my first lessons in being an ally, which is that you don't get to just walk in and decide which you think needs to be done or what you think should be done, but you need to listen to the folks on the front lines of the struggle and respond to that, find a role to play. So in 1979, we set up the Oakland Men's Project to work with men around issues of male violence. Now at that time, men around the country were hearing that talk to the men, and many folks were setting up batterers programs, men's counseling centers, sexual assault offenders programs, things like that, doing group work or individual work with men. And we realized that if we started doing any direct service or counseling work with men, we would quickly become overwhelmed with that and unable to do anything like education work, prevention work, mobilizing work. And so we set up the Oakland Men's Project to do the other things, not the counseling, not the direct one-on-one and group work. Now, most of us in the Oakland Men's Project had some experience doing that, and it informed our work very deeply. But our work was more about looking at the conditions that set up the violence rather than responding to the individual situations. So we started going out to men's groups, talking about issues of male violence, sexism, male roles, and things like that. And we quickly began to be invited into schools by friends of ours who were teachers and educators. And so we went into high schools and middle schools around the Bay Area, and basically we had a very simple message to the young men that we were talking with. And the message was, you're hitting your girlfriends, that's bad, stop it. And that wasn't very well received. They wanted to know who we were and where we were coming from, and they said, they were actually very honest with us. They said, well, sometimes we do hit our girlfriends, but if you're serious about helping us sort out the violence, you have to look at the family violence. You have to look at the gang violence. You have to look at the fights on the playground. You have to look at the hate crimes and the gay bashing and all the different ways that interpersonal violence is part of our lives and our community. Well, that was a lot to take in because we were coming from a pretty simple kind of narrative around interpersonal violence. But on top of that, they said, it's not just the interpersonal violence. Look at the state of our schools. Look at the racial profiling and police brutality. Look at the environmental toxic dumping in our communities. If you want to help us sort out issues of violence, then you also have to help us look at the institutional levels of that violence. So this was, hard to hear, but we were committed to listening to the people that we were talking with. And it really sent us back to the drawing boards and having to rethink from a very basic level what we were doing and where we were coming from and what we wanted to see in the work. And one of the things we realized is, and my colleague Neil Myhan came up with this image of the tree of violence. And got the tree of violence on the next slide here. But basically it's a tree with the branches of the tree of violence having all the various ways that interpersonal violence and personal violence impacts our lives. And many of us have jobs up in the top of the branches of the tree of violence. We're dealing with individual families, individuals, relationships, people who are committing violence against themselves or against others in the community. And what we realize is that what happens, many of us are paid really, our jobs are to prune the branches of the tree of violence. Well, what happens when you prune a tree? Obviously it grows back, and in fact it can grow back even bushier and healthier than it was before you pruned it. So we realized that if we were only pruning the branches of the tree of violence, we weren't all that serious about uprooting the tree. And what are the roots that hold the tree in place? Well, they're the institutionalized systems, racism, homophobia, sexism, economic exploitation, adultism, etc., that perpetrate on the constant interpersonal violence that we find in our communities. So we began to call our work root work because it was about looking at the roots of violence and helping people address those issues while providing the services and direct intervention in the branches at the same time. And so it really became important for us to step back and have a larger framework for the work that we were doing. Now, but we were still going into the classroom and out in the community and talking to men and young people in general. And we were seeing each one of them as individuals. And our goals were basically to help men and young men stop being violent and help adult women and young women survive and get on with their lives and avoid violence. And what we realized talking to young people and to adults was that in fact these are community issues, and people are in communities, whether it's a classroom or school or a community or organization or a cultural community, that people are already in communities. And if we're treating them as individuals, one by one, trying to change people's minds, we were never going to actually contribute to very much real transformation in our communities. So we began to focus more on helping people understand that they were in community, to be able to talk about the differences they have in those communities across race and gender and class and all kinds of other differences, and to be able to identify the problems they face and come up with the answers that are already available in the communities. So again, this was a major shift in how we saw the work as a form of supporting the leadership and the development of the community's capacity to respond to violence rather than trying to change individuals one by one in kind of a hit or miss strategy.
So Paul,
yeah?
This is Cammie. We had a question just asking you to explain adultism a little bit more.
Okay, good. Thank you for that question. And I will come to this in just a minute, but what we began to understand was that there were a system of intertwining oppressions, each somewhat unique but interwoven with all the others. And racism and homophobia and sexism, most people are familiar with. But the systematic way that young people are targeted for violence and marginalization and disempowerment is actually a really important system among the other systems of oppression, because it actually trains all of us to accept the whole system. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to move to the next slide, which will help illustrate this a little bit, I think. But we live in a system in a society in which power is divided up unequally, and some groups have more social, political, economic power than other groups. And if you look at the left of the chart, adults have more power and control than young people or seniors, men than women, rich than working and middle-class folks, white people than people of color, and on down the line. And the thing about adultism is that as young people, that's where and how we learn to accept this whole system, this social system of inequality, marginalization, exploitation, and violence. So we realize too that if we went into a community or in a classroom or anywhere and started talking about what separated people, like sexism or racism, that we would leave people more divided, and it was hard for people to think about how they could work together across those differences. But if we started out with adultism, all of us were young people. All of us were disempowered or marginalized or face various kinds of limits to what we could do and participate in. And so it was a way to start the conversation with both young people and adults at the level in which we can all understand a little bit about how a system of oppression works and how we're all caught up in that. So when I say adultism, I mean that systematic oppression, and I say it in the sense that it works similarly to other systems of oppression, in that it's pervasive, it's systematic, it's widespread, and it's part of our daily lives. So yeah. So let me stay with this chart for just a couple of minutes before moving on. Oh, the other part of the adultism that needs mentioning is that very often people on the least powerful side are not only vulnerable to violence, but blamed for that violence. And very often young people are blamed for the violence in our society. They're blamed for being violent, whereas most young people are much more likely to be the victims of violence from adults than to perpetuate violence themselves. We blame them for using guns, but it's adults who manufacture guns and bring them into our communities and profit off them. We blame young people for using drugs, but again, it's adults who grow and raise drugs, distribute them, profit from them, and are more likely to use them. And we blame, of course, we blame young women for getting pregnant and young men for getting them pregnant, but it's adults that deny young people the information about birth control and sexuality, gender identity, and sexual orientation that makes it hard for young people to make healthy choices. So a part of adultism, part of all the systems of oppression, is how the people who are least powerful get blamed for the violence that they're impacted by. So this system, this power chart works on 3 levels. One is the direct violence that people experience. And if you're a man, you're obviously protected from various levels of violence. And if you're a woman, you're obviously vulnerable to various levels of violence that men aren't vulnerable to. The second level is that instead of holding men responsible for sexual assault and domestic violence, we often blame women for that by, as you all know, asking what they were wearing, or what time were they out there, or what did they say or do, or why did they trust him, or what were they drinking, etc. A whole lot of questions that hold the woman responsible rather than the man. The questions we should ask, of course, is why did he do that, and what are we going to do about it? And the third level that the system operates on is that if you hear all your life that you're to blame, you begin to internalize that. So for those of us in groups on the least powerful side, we often internalize that we're responsible in some way for what happens to us, that maybe we didn't work hard enough, maybe we didn't not pretty enough, maybe we shouldn't have trusted that person, etc. And so those 3 different levels all make these systems very hard to identify and to challenge. I'd like to encourage everybody who's on the call to look at the power chart up and down on both sides, and just to identify where you are, all the different parts of it that you experience. And just take a moment to take in that. I think it's clear that we all start off as young people, so we all get some basic education in how this system works and pressure to accept it. We all become adults, and therefore we're promised at least one group to pass on our pain and anger and frustration towards. Some of these groups are fixed. Others may change over a lifetime. It makes a big difference how much we're on either side. The more I'm on the left, the more categories I'm on the left of the chart, the more I benefit cumulatively from the system. And the more I'm on the right side, the least powerful groups, the more I am vulnerable to violence and exploitation. So it makes a lot of difference how much we're on either side. But it means that most of us are on both sides, at least in a couple of categories, and that means that we have both some experience of being less powerful and vulnerable, and some experience of being powerful and privileged in certain ways, and able to step up as allies in those categories. And that's really important for us to remember. And of course, these are conversations that we don't have in our communities very often, looking at these systems. And so often we end up unable to talk to each other or unable to deal with issues of race, class, and gender and other things because they are acting in our meetings, in our organizations, in our community groups, but we're not naming them, addressing them, and talking about the implications of them. So part of so somebody is asking a question is the chart listed in the order of my belief? No, I don't think it is. I think that all of these systems are important and interlocking. And what I've noticed is that in groups that I'm in on the less powerful side, I'm much more clear about, but in groups that I'm on the more powerful side, I tend to not be so clear about or so powerful in. So as a man, I'm not as conscious of sexism all the time, whereas a Jewish person, I'm always conscious of anti-Semitism because that's a survival for me. So for those of us who are in the top categories on the left-hand side or not, they may seem more important, but if you are a person with a disability and can't even get into the room to be part of the conversation, then that's not a less important issue than race or class necessarily. Or if you're a recent immigrant and are constantly in fear of being deported or exploited, then that's not less important than race and class, for instance, although it's intimately tied to those. So let's see. So I want to do just a little bit more work with you before I open it up to questions and further conversation. These are all tools we use with both young people and adults to help understand the roots of violence and also move towards figuring out what we can do about it. And of course, one of the things we have to look at is looking at that power chart is who really benefits from all of that. Those of us in more powerful groups gain a little bit, but most of us are on both sides of the chart and are equally vulnerable to various kinds of marginalization. But there are people in our society that gain a lot from the way this is set up, and so we need to look at the economic structure. And the chart up here has both the population and wealth of the United States. The top group is 1% of the population, and that controls about 42–43% of the total wealth of the country. The financial wealth, stocks and bonds and land and buildings and businesses. The next 19% controls approximately another 50% of the wealth. And so that's a tremendous amount of the wealth, the financial wealth of the country, tied up in the top 20% of the population. And that leaves the 80% of us at the bottom of the pyramid dividing up somewhere around 7 to 8% of the wealth. Obviously, this leads directly to intense competition and pressure for that 7 and 8%, trying to get our share to keep a roof over our heads, our children clothed and fed. And there's a direct result in interpersonal violence from this kind of distribution of wealth. At the same time, there is direct violence caused by this as well. The various policies that are used to enforce the systems that we live in. And a lot of the direct effects of that are unemployment, homelessness, lack of health care, lack of food. The unequal distribution of wealth means that a lot of people just don't have access to basic necessities. So there's direct violence, and there's ways that we internalize it and act it out against those around us. The next screen is a slightly more colorful way of looking at the whole system. But this is, again, it's not something we talk about very much, and it affects all of us. We're all figuring out how to survive, how to support families, how to succeed in our lives, and it's at the same time, we don't very often talk about the economic structure of our society and the impact it has on our communities. Particularly for young people, they're trying to figure this out. They know about this. You know, all of us have some intuitive sense that things are really out of balance and unequal. But at the same time, we're not helping each other figure out ways to not only survive in the system, but to challenge it and to avoid passing on the violence towards those around us, which is often what we end up doing. So I could obviously talk a lot more about each of these and the way that we weave them together into our work in the community, but one of the things that we really come back to regularly is the role that people can play in being an ally in standing with those who are most marginalized and interrupting the cycles of violence and the institutional violence. The concept of being an ally is a really important one because it is a place for people to step up and step in in an active way to make a difference. Very often, for instance, when we talk to men about sexism, they feel like they're being named as the problem, and there's not really a role for them to play. If we talk to young people about violence in the community, they feel like they can't really do anything about it. But if we offer them the role of an ally, then it's an invitation to get involved. It's a confirmation that they're needed, that they have a role to play and a contribution to make. And we know that people in general want things to be different and want to be part of making them different, and often don't know how to do that. So the role of an ally is one way that people can start to think about, well, how do we take care of ourselves in the community? How do we stand up for each other? How do we interrupt the violence and oppression that we see around us? This is one particular version that we use with young men, but there's various other versions that we have. And it's three simple statements. I promise not to be violent to my friends, my family, my lover, or anyone else. I promise to be an ally to myself, to my sisters and brothers, and anyone under attack. And I promise to stand up for people and build my community. And we really invite people to try this on, to think about what does it mean to be an ally. And of course, people have always been allies to each other in the community. Going back to the power chart that we were looking at earlier, people on the least powerful side have always organized together to gain access to equal opportunity and resources and jobs and housing, etc. And people on the more powerful groups, some have always stepped up as allies. When women were trying to get the right to vote, men stepped up and supported suffrage, and when people of color were the abolition movement, for instance, or the civil rights movement, white people stood up to support those struggles, and on down the chart. So there's a long history in our communities of people stepping up to be allies to others in the community. And we have a kind of less informal roles of allies that people have played in communities to protect people who were survivors of violence, to protect people from becoming victims of violence, and to confront abusers in various ways, in both subtle and direct ways. And so even at that level, there's a long history in our communities of people being allies, of stepping up, figuring out ways, getting together with other people and figuring out ways to intervene in situations that called for it. So this is a key concept of what we do in the work, is help people figure out what does it mean to be an ally, to stand with people under attack. What's our role in making a difference? And so to kind of sum up this particular thing, there's kind of three levels of being an ally. One is to ourselves, and that means taking care of ourselves and not being destructive to ourselves. One is to each other, to reaching out and supporting each other in whatever ways that calls for. And then the third level is being an ally to those in need and who are under attack, stepping up to intervene in situations where someone is being abused, hurt, attacked, put down, harassed, teased, bullied, or discriminated against. And what we find is that a lot of folks are really waiting for this kind of invitation, that it's a very powerful way to help people see that they have a role to play, and then we can actually begin to talk about, well, what are those roles and what needs to be done and what problems do we face in our communities and where do we go from here. So before I open it up, I just want to say that we see our work operating in kind of three levels. And this is on top of any kind of social service we're providing. But the larger framework is that we're doing organizing work, that we're actually organizing people to come together to identify the problems they face and to make a difference, that we're doing leadership development, that we're giving more people the individual capacity to step up in the role of allies, and people need skills, they need experience, they need opportunities to get involved, and they need support for that leadership, whether they're young people or adults. And finally, that the overall goal is intergenerational movement building, capacity building for our communities, so that as things break down, as there's stress, as people act out violence towards each other or themselves, that we have higher and higher level of ability and capacity to respond to that in a transformative way rather than a punitive or criminal legal kind of way. So those are kind of the broader framework of the work we're trying to do, and these are some of the tools that we do it with. And one of the things, the concepts that we often grapple with is, therefore, how do we do this in accountable ways, especially for those of us who are working in not community-based organizations, but in what I might call buffer zone organizations or nonprofit organizations or government-funded organizations how do we stay accountable to folks in our communities and the grassroots struggles there, so that we are not coming in with an outside of an agenda, but are actually responding to the needs of the people who live in the communities that we claim to be serving. So the issue of accountability is very important and just part of the ongoing conversations that we need to have in doing this work. So I want to open it up to questions, comments, thoughts. Does any of this make sense? Where do you have challenges? Where should we go in the conversation? We have, I think, about another 15 minutes or so. Until the questions start coming in, I can say that one of the things we've also found about doing this work is that we have to find ways to do it sustainably over time, that these are long-term, working for social justice and is a long-term lifetime work. And therefore we have to kind of know some of that history and let that nourish us, but we also have to find ways to sustain each other and ourselves in doing this work. And so personal care and figuring out ways in our organizations and communities to support each other, affirm each other's leadership are really essential. And that's something that often many of us are so busy taking care of other people, responding to other people's crises, that we are not so good at the taking care of ourselves aspects of it. So that's another piece that we found is to be very crucial in doing the work.
Well, hi, this is Ann Roush, and I work at the Council on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. Can you hear me? I'm on speaker.
Yes, I can.
And I just wanted to thank you for bringing forward this conversation again with regard to intersectionality of oppressions. I think it's a conversation that we had, in the 70s and 80s. Originally, when the sexual assault movement, civil rights, sexual assault movement, battered women's movement, and I think it's one that's been lost through time. We don't hear, and we're, at least in Alaska, we're grappling with bringing that forward in our prevention work and making the connections. So, just a comment, this was just really wonderful to sit in on and remember and learn again. I loved the tree of violence, and when we discuss root causes, just to refocus and reframe that again for myself and my own work, and then doing work in the community. So thanks for that.
Sure.
And do you find that in your work or in your area, I mean, in Alaska, in our discussions, I find that we don't bring those conversations forward in a way that we did 2 decades or 2 decades ago. Is that something you're experiencing, or?
Well, I think it's still very much true that we tend to slice and dice our issues. We get funded separately for different categories of issues, so that there's not a lot of groups that actually have more of an integrated community building approach to doing violence prevention work. And that means that it's often very limited in the impact that we have, because people don't lead their lives in separate categories. We're whole people. So if you're a woman and a Native person, you're not sometimes facing racism and sometimes facing sexism. You're facing both. And if I'm Jewish and working class, then I don't separate those aspects of my life during the day. So it makes it, when we don't have that kind of holistic intersectional analysis, it makes us unable to actually respond to the conditions that people are really facing in their lives. And it also makes us unable to build broader coalitions. So I think it is, I think more people realize that, and more people are trying to build coalitions, but still there's a lot of serious constraints around doing the work in that kind of holistic way.
Paul, this is Sherry from QNI. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I really want to ditto kind of what Ann said about thanking you so much. This has been extremely helpful and interesting. I really like the Ally Pledge and the levels of being an ally, and I will probably use those if you don't mind.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think that we often get into our specific population that we're trying to help, when in actuality, really the focus should be on the human condition overall and the oppression overall, because especially in the prevention work, we're trying to do some prevention work here in Kenai, and it's limited to, again, women and children, victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, and yet there's got to be those pieces that take into account the whole and that oppression overall. And I think that's one of the most challenging things, is that, when you're trying to build community support, oftentimes the community will look at what you do and see that or feel that it's limited. And they kind of just stop at that point, rather than, and I guess the challenge for us is, how do we get over that hump where that people are applying these concepts to respect and dignity of all human beings?
Right. I can give you an example of where I've seen that work really well. In Louisville, Kentucky, there's a group called the Fairness Campaign, basically. And it's a coalition of workers and unions, of LGBT groups, of women's groups, and people of color-led organizations that frame things in terms of fairness and social justice. And so that when they work on issues that cross those lines. And they've built a very broad coalition that, when things come up on the ballot, they can whether they're anti-gay or they're racist or sexist, they can challenge them. They can bring together a large coalition of folks to challenge them, because they've established the relationships, because they've acknowledged the intersections. And there's other communities in other places that are also building coalitions like that, that reach out to our common humanity, our common needs, our common human rights, and are much more effective, I think, in the long term of building that sense of community.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think that it does go a long way to reaching out to everybody, because, again, what we do is extremely important and vital, but it does put up barriers for other people getting involved.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, somebody asked a question online about the bystander concept. So somebody from the Green Dot.
This is Carrie in Nome. I'm the one who put it up there.
Okay.
What I was making kind of a comment about is we just are starting in the state of Alaska looking at the Green Dot program. Do you know of that program?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that.
Okay, and I didn't know what your experience was with it, and I guess part of what I wanted to say is I think it is nice because I think that idea of allies and working with allies is really reflected in the Green Dot with the idea that you're involving everybody and seeing everybody as somebody who can contribute to stopping violence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's part of the strength of that program. I think that the difference between that and the concept of being an ally is that the concept of being an ally is premised on being part of a community and not kind of an optional, you can decide to be a bystander has kind of an optional quality to it. It's like you're not really involved, but you could be, and maybe you should be, but it's that kind of an individual choice, which is important, but I think even more deeply needed is a sense that we're all part of a community and in this together, and we need to find ways to take care of ourselves and each other, not just when somebody's getting hit by somebody else. That there's levels of exploitation and systematic violation and marginalization going on in our communities that needs to be addressed, and that social justice part of it isn't held by the bystander concept in general. So I would push folks to push that bystander concept, into a broader social justice kind of framework.
That makes sense because we're also in NOME, we're getting together and doing, we have a racial equity group that's also talking about issues in town. So, and they work, many of the people work in both programs. So thank you for that.
Okay.
To think about with especially the issue of allies.
Uh-huh.
Making it a little more than just bystander.
Right.
Or a lot more.
Other questions or thoughts from folks? We have just a few more minutes. I should say that all of the slides are on my website. There's a lot of resources there. And we also have a book called Helping Teens Stop Violence, Build Community, and Stand for Justice, which is geared for training both adults and young people to use this framework, use the concept of being an ally, and actually think about, how to move this work forward. We also have a high school curriculum called Making the Peace, a middle school curriculum called Making Allies, Making Friends. We also have gender-separate curricula, young men's work and young women's lives, as well as other materials and books and curricula. So I encourage you to check out the website and also to use me as a resource. The last slide that I will put up here has my email address, my phone number, and my website. And I'm glad to be in conversation with folks informally or more formally in terms of thinking about doing the work and how to make it really effective and meaningful. So I will mention a couple of organizations that have done a lot of work around transformative justice, which I think are important resources for people to know about. One is called Generation 5, and they've been doing work for several years. Their goal was to eliminate child sexual assault in the next 5 generations, and that's really the kind of vision we need. That's a 100-year vision. And their work now is to do the work of the first generation. And what does it mean to do the work now so that the next generation that comes along will be able to build on that? And of course, in the battered women's movement and rape prevention movement, we already have a generation. So we're now in the second generation. So it calls for a little different thinking. But they have on their website, a lot of information about transformative justice. And the other group is called Community Interventions. and they have been collecting stories of how people in communities respond to situations of interpersonal violence in informal and not within the formal systems of government and et cetera. And they've also put together a very detailed manual for doing transformative justice work in communities with lots of worksheets and questionnaires and guidelines, and it's very, very useful for thinking about beyond the interventions, beyond the immediate how do we stop this situation of violence. We need to be thinking about it, I think, so much in the framework of how do we use each situation as a stepping stone to building the capacity of the community to respond differently the next time and to prevent violence the next time. So both of those organizations are really focused on that kind of framework. So if there's no other questions or comments, I will say goodbye and thank you all for the work that you're doing in your communities, and hopefully I can be a resource and support that.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Please stand by.